Hello and welcome to today's video podcast for evolution and diversity. This is our last video podcast that will be covering the plants, and we're going to end with a discussion of angiosperms. As you're going to learn, angiosperms are the largest and most diverse group of plants. They represent about 85% of all living plants. So one might think that angiosperms represent a rather old lineage of plants, but that's not the case. They actually are a relatively new form of plants, and they're about 150 million years old. And the reason that plants have been able to dominate in such a short period of time is due to adaptive radiation. And we're going to talk about all of this as we move forward today. And to get started, we're going to talk about the characteristics of angiosperms, and then we'll talk about the evolutionary significance of angiosperms adaptations. And then we're going to spend some time talking about coevolution, which will be a new term, and also adaptive radiation, which is a term we've used in the past. And then we're going to close talking about some different groups of angiosperms. But let's go ahead and get started with the characteristics of angiosperms. All right, let's go ahead and get started with a discussion of the distinguishing characteristics of angiosperms. And so I'm just going to list them right now. The first is that they have flowers. And then the second is that they have fruits. And they also have something called double fertilization. These three things, flowers, fruits, and double fertilization, are distinguishing characteristics of angiosperms that sets them apart from other plants. And in the next objective, we're going to talk about why flowers and fruits and double fertilization offered an adaptive evolutionary advantage. But let's think about these characteristics now as it relates to angiosperms and go back to the question that we always ask when we start talking about a new group of plants, and that is, are angiosperms monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? So let's go and look at a phylogenetic tree. And so you can see a very familiar phylogenetic tree that we've looked at quite a bit over the past several video podcasts. And we can see our non-vascular plants, and remember we said these were paraphyletic. And the seedless vascular plants, we said they were paraphyletic, because their common ancestor included more than just the species that were within that group. And then when we got to gymnosperms, in our last video, we said gymnosperms were monophyletic, because their common ancestor here led to all of the gymnosperms, and only the gymnosperms. And then down here we are dealing with our good friends, the angiosperms today. And so are they monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic? Which I realize I just misspelled. So go ahead and hit pause if you'd like and think about whether these are monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic. So what we can say for certain is that angiosperms are monophyletic because they have a common ancestor here of all the angiosperms, and it includes only the angiosperms. And when we get towards the last objective of today's video, we're going to see that there's going to be several different groups that we're going to talk about. In particular, we're going to talk about 4 different groups of angiosperms. There are more than 4, but we're going to talk about these 4. Now let's spend just a little bit of time talking about the alternation of generations that we see in angiosperms. And similarly as the gymnosperms, the angiosperms have a dominant sporophyte and dependent gametophytes. They have dependent gametophytes largely because they exhibit heterospory. Let's just briefly walk through this alternation of generation. So we have our mature diploid sporophyte. This is the part you would typically see when you're looking at an angiosperm. It includes the stem, the leaves, the flower, and in some cases you would see a fruit. Remember I said they exhibit heterospory, so they're going to produce 2 different kinds of spores. The first one is the microspore, and it will go on to develop the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grain, just like we talked about with gymnosperms. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. And then the other type of spore that is formed is the megaspore, just like we saw with the gymnosperms. It's produced in the megasporangium, and it is protected inside of this ovary. All right, now let's pick up the pollen grain. Just like we saw with the gymnosperms, the pollen grains will land on the megasporangium, and it will grow a pollen tube that allows the sperm to travel down. And then the sperm at the base here will fertilize 2 different eggs. And so this is a process that we call double fertilization, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But for right now, let's talk about what each of these fertilization events will accomplish. The first one accomplishes the formation of the zygote, the embryo which will go on to form the next generation of sporophyte. The other fertilization event will produce something called the endosperm. And the endosperm provides the nutrition needed for the embryo within the seed. From the ovary, the fruit will grow, and the fruit will help in seed dispersal, as we'll talk about in a moment. And when that seed germinates and begins to grow, it will develop into the mature sporophyte, and then the whole process will begin again. Okay, now what I'd like to do is come back to these three distinguishing characteristics and explain why they provided an evolutionary adaptive advantage for the angiosperms. And let's begin by talking about flowers. And to begin with, let's draw a structure of a flower. And in general, a flower will contain the male reproductive structures, called the stamen, and the female reproductive structures, called the carpels. Let's begin by drawing the carpel. And within the carpel, let's identify three structures that you should be aware of. The first is the stigma. That is this very top part here. And it is best described as the sticky tip. And the stigma is important because it helps stimulate the growth of the pollen down this long structure here. And this long structure is called the style. The style is this elongated stalk. And this structure down here is the ovary. And within the ovary, you will find the ovule, the egg. Now let's draw in here the stamen, the male reproductive structures. And there are two parts of the stamen I want to draw your attention to. And the first structure I want to point out is the anther. That is this very top part of the stamen. Its claim to fame is that this is where the pollen is produced. And the other structure I want to point out is the filament. And that is just this stalk right here. Okay, there are two other structures I want to point out, and they're not associated with either the stamen or the carpel, but they're parts that you've certainly seen before. And I'm going to have a really hard time drawing these on here, so bear with me. But the first are the petals. So remember, the petals are the colored parts of the flowers that we see. And I apologize for my lack of drawing here, but you're probably used to that at this point. So these are the petals. So what is the purpose of the petal? And the petal has an important purpose because it attracts pollinators. This last structure is a very important part, and I'm going to draw it like so. And it is the sepal. And this is very important because it protects the ovary. Before the flower blooms, the sepal will wrap around and protect the ovary. When the flower blooms, it opens up, exposing the flower. Before we move on to talking about the fruit, let's ask, what is the adaptive advantage of a flower? Well, from the drawing, you saw a few things already. One is that it protects the ovaries. And one of the main advantages is that the flower attracts pollinators. These are animals that will remove pollen from one plant and take it to another plant. And so some examples of pollinators are bees, birds, bats, beetles, wasps, butterflies, and moths. A whole variety of different animals that can act as pollinators. And we're going to come back to this later on when we talk about coevolution and adaptive radiation. But let's move on to the fruits. So let's begin with a definition and description of fruits. So fruits are the sweet and fleshy part of an angiosperm. It protects the seed inside it. It protects the seed inside it. The outer layer of a fruit is called the pericarp. The pericarp is often edible. So for instance, that outer layer of a tomato that protects the seeds within it is the pericarp. And the next thing I want to say is that fruits are derived from the ovaries. So to give you a frame of reference, if you think about a pea pod, like so, and all the peas inside of it, the peas are the seeds, and this outside coat here of the pea pod, that's the wall of the ovary. So all of this here is the fruit. Okay, so what are some adaptive advantages of the fruit? One of the most important advantages is that it helps in seed dispersal. We talked about this in the last video podcast when we introduced the concept of a seed, but in angiosperms, where they have this nice tasty fruit that animals might eat, they'll eat and digest the fleshy part of the fruit, but the seed part of it is not digestible. So then that seed is distributed in that animal's feces. And the fruit also helps protect the seed. With 300,000 different species of angiosperms, it's not going to be surprising for you to learn that there's quite a bit of fruit variation. There's different ways you could describe the variation we see in fruits, but I want to focus on how fruits are arranged. I'm going to list them here, and then I'm going to show pictures of them. The first is a simple fruit. An example of this might be a cherry, where you have just this one fruit structure. The other way that the fruit can be arranged is seen in the aggregate fruit. And you've probably seen this before if you've ever seen a blackberry. And the last one is multiple fruits. And you would see this in a pineapple. So let's look at a few pictures. So here's the simple fruit with the cherry as the example, and then to the bottom left here you see the aggregate fruit, where you see the aggregation of the different fruit. It's important to remember that this develops from a single flower, but then you end up with multiple and separate carpel. The multiple fruit, and the pineapple is probably the best example of it here. And what you see are many different flowers on the same pineapple, and each represents a ripened ovary in the mature pineapple shown here. So each of these sections here is a ripened ovary. All right, let's move on to double fertilization. Remember, this is one of the characteristics that are unique to angiosperm. I already mentioned double fertilization earlier, but I want to spend a little bit more time talking about it in a little bit more detail. All right, let's go ahead and redraw the carpel, the female reproductive structure in angiosperms. With the stigma on top here that will recruit the pollen and stimulate the growth of the pollen tube, the style, the stalk that connects the stigma to the ovary here at the bottom. And remember, the ovary, as I said before, contains the ovule. I want to say a little bit more about the ovule and the DNA that happens to be in it. So it starts off as a 2N cell during development, and it will go through meiosis to produce 4 haploid cells, 4 cells that are each 1N. Now, during this process of meiosis, of going from a diploid cell to these 4 haploid cells, it's important to note that it's not an equal distribution, meaning that one of these cells will be much larger. And ultimately, this is going to develop into the egg. Well, what happens to these other cells? Well, I don't want to go into too gory of detail, but I'll just say that through a process of extra cell divisions using mitosis, this ovule up here, I'm going to draw it fairly big here, will contain 3 haploid cells at the top of the ovule and 2 haploid nuclei at the bottom where the pollen will enter, plus this 1 haploid cell which will become the egg, all right here. And so it should be noted that each of these will contain a nucleus, right? A haploid nucleus. So over here I'm just going to draw a dot and say that equals 1N. There are 2 haploid nuclei here in the center of the ovule that will fuse together to form a diploid cell. So this one here is a diploid, 2N. All right, so through this process of meiosis and mitosis, we get a structure like this. And so why did I go into all this detail here? Well, it helps to understand why double fertilization occurs. Let's go back to the carpel, and let's have a pollen grain land on top of it here. And remember, it's going to extend the pollen tube all the way down here. It's going to wrap around here and insert itself into this ovule. Along this pollen tube are going to be 2 haploid nuclei, 2 1N nuclei. Okay, so to understand what's going to happen next, once these sperm enter this pollen tube, I redrew this ovule here, up here, but made it a little bit bigger so we have some room to work. So let's draw this pollen tube as it extends around the ovule and inserts it inside of the ovule. What will happen next is that one of the sperm, which I'm going to show here with the haploid nucleus around the red cell, will fuse with this diploid cell in the middle of the ovule. And through the magic of time-lapse photography, you're going to see that this forms a triploid. And there it is. So this is a triploid. And this is called the endosperm. And I'll come back in a moment to describe the endosperm. So that accounts for one of the sperm that entered into this ovule. What about the other one? Well, the other one fertilized the egg. And again, through the magic of time-lapse photography, we're going to see that these two fuse into a diploid cell. And there you have it, the diploid cell, and this is the zygote. This will then enter into a series of mitotic cell divisions, leading to the embryo, which will be packaged into the seed, and then the angiosperms, it will have a fruit that extends around it. So we understand what a zygote is, but let's come back to this endosperm and talk about what it does and why it's important. The endosperm provides nutrients to the developing embryo in angiosperms. You can also think of the endosperm as the equivalent of the female gametophyte in gymnosperms. One thing that makes the endosperm different than the female gametophyte is that the female gametophyte has no male contribution, and it's diploid. The endosperm has male contribution. So the question you might be asking is, why does this matter? What is the evolutionary advantage for angiosperms to make an endosperm, as opposed to just having the female gametophyte provide the nourishment? Well, the short answer is we don't really know, but there are two hypotheses, and I want to just briefly mention them. The first is that from an evolutionary perspective, early on, double fertilization produced two diploid embryos. Each of these embryos would have been capable of sustaining life. It's possible that this allowed for one of these to be selected over the other. Maybe one of them would have had some greater fitness advantage, or maybe one of them was defective in some way, and it allowed to have sort of a backup embryo. But what happened over the course of evolution is that one of the embryos took on a supportive role and became the endosperm. So throughout this process, there would have had to have been some reason to go from a diploid to a triploid, and maybe that triploid just prevented it from developing into an actual embryo. It forced it into this role as a supportive structure, the endosperm. And this other idea is a little deeper. And when you take genetics, we'll talk about it a little bit more. And if you take epigenetics, we'll talk about it even more. And this has to do with something known as parental conflict. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but to say that both parents are interested in producing the most fit progeny. That is, both mom and dad want to have an embryo that is produced that is going to survive so that they can pass their genes on to the next generation. Sometimes the male or the female may have a different strategy to achieve this, to achieve having the most fit progeny. And ultimately, from a genetic sense, they come to some sort of compromise in order to produce the most fit progeny so that both parents can win, so to speak, in this evolutionary battle. So the endosperm, in this sense, allows both parents to contribute to nutrition. Important to note that we don't really know for sure why the endosperm provided an evolutionary advantage to the angiosperms. So these are just two ideas. The first one, I think, is easier to understand. You're producing a backup embryo, and over time that backup embryo takes on this secondary role to support the developing embryo. This one down here is more of a concept that, from an evolutionary sense, both parents have to be able to contribute in order to produce a progeny that is fit enough to survive. Okay, let's move on to our third objective for today's video podcast, and that is to talk about coevolution and adaptive radiation and how they apply to angiosperms. Let's first begin with a definition of coevolution. And this is when there are two interacting species that reciprocally influence each other's adaptations over time. There's a lot of examples seen throughout evolution, but not surprisingly, we're going to focus on angiosperms and pollinators. And earlier I listed several pollinators, and so let's just refresh our memory of what pollinators are. And so you see here several examples of pollinators: bees, butterflies, wasps, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats, and wind, and ourselves. So you can see a wide variety of animals that are important pollinators. That is, they will take pollen from one plant and deliver it to another plant. Now they do this because they get something out of it. They get a food source, nectar, from the plant. So as they're feeding on the plant, they will pick up all that pollen, and then when they fly to a new flower, they will be able to pollinate that flower, delivering the pollen to the ovule. But in order for each of these animals that we see in these pictures here to be able to feed upon these plants, they had to evolve with the plants. The bees and the butterflies and the moths, they had to develop the right size proboscis to be able to get the nectar from the plants. Birds had to evolve the right size beak in order to get to the nectar in the flower. All of these animals had to adapt in order to feed on the flower, and the flower benefited from that by being able to spread its pollen, its genome, to other flowers. I'm going to show you a few examples how the color, the shape, and sometimes the smell of a flower will attract a certain pollinator. So for instance, the carrion flowers, they have a lovely characteristic of smelling like rotting flesh. Now, a lot of pollinators aren't going to be as interested in feeding from this carrion flower. However, many flies are. So these flies have adapted a tolerance to the odor of these plants, and in return, they receive nutrition. And the plant then benefits because the fly will take pollen from this carrion flower to another carrion flower. In the middle here, you see a hummingbird. They are a very important pollinator of many kinds of flowers, particularly flowers that have a long tube with nectar at the base. So only a pollinator, such as the hummingbird that has a long beak, is able to reach down the tube here and get the nectar. As it's doing that, all of these anthers that have pollen on them are going to be landing onto the hummingbird's beak. And so now when it goes to another flower of another plant, it will deliver that pollen to that plant. Bees are a good example of a pollinator that is attracted to certain colors. We often see bees attracted to bright flowers, such as bright purple flowers. And as we saw in the previous two, it has adapted an attraction to certain flowers, and so those flowers provide the nectar to the bee, and then the bee provides a method to pass that pollen on to the next plant. All right, so I'd like to talk about this specific example to understand how both the flower and a pollinator will evolve with each other and how they both will benefit. Remember that the flower and the pollinator, from an evolutionary perspective, have one goal, and that is to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. In order for these two to help each other out, the flower needs some kind of adaptation to provide the moth with a food source so that the moth will transfer the flower's genes. But the plant doesn't want just any pollinator coming along and then taking its pollen to any other plant. It wants to specifically attract one type of pollinator, in this case, this moth, so that it will take the pollen from this plant and take it to another plant of the same species so that they can reproduce. If it just took any old pollinator and that pollen would just go onto any old flower, that's not a good strategy, because it wants to be able to successfully reproduce in order to pass on its genes. So the pollinator has to be specific to this plant. So the moth has to have some kind of adaptation that makes it unique. In this case, this moth has this very long proboscis, essentially a tube that allows it to acquire nectar from this plant. And in this plant here, you see, well, you can't see it, but I'm telling you, at the very base here, this is where the nectar is. And so a fruit fly would be very frustrated on this plant because it would never be able to reach the nectar. However, this moth has a long enough proboscis for it to be inserted all the way down into this very long stem here where the nectar's at the bottom. And because it has a long enough proboscis, it can do that. If this long stem, or spurs is labeled here, was any longer, then the moth wouldn't be able to use it, and then nobody benefits. If it's much shorter, it's possible a different pollinator could acquire the nutrients and take the pollen. But since only this one type of moth here is able to acquire this pollen of this type of flower, it will then keep going from one flower of this species to another flower of this species, thereby taking pollen from one flower to another flower, allowing them to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. Likewise, because this plant, this flower, is providing moths, and only moths with this long proboscis, a necessary food source, only moths with this long proboscis will be able to pass on their genes. Moths that have a shorter proboscis just won't be as successful. So because of this, this flower evolved to have this long spur here, and at the same time, this moth, the pollinator, evolved to have this very long proboscis. They mutually benefited from this relationship. We would call this a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. All right, now let's bring in adaptive radiation, because it's related to this coevolution with the pollinators. In Darwin's studies, he viewed evolution and natural selection from a gradualist perspective of evolution. And when he came across the flowering plants, it didn't really fit with that model. So he referred to the evolution of angiosperms as the abominable mystery. But we now understand how the angiosperms arose and why they arose in a very rapid manner. Remember, at the beginning of the podcast, I said angiosperms are the most abundant of plants. They're approximately 80% of all plants living today. However, they're a relatively young group of plants. Between 125 and 150 million years ago did they first arise. To account for such wide diversity within the angiosperms, it's hard to imagine that that could have occurred in such a relatively short period of time. We now understand how angiosperms arose so quickly, and that is through the explanation of adaptive radiation. We've talked about this term earlier in the semester, but let me remind you of what it is. It's when a single lineage produces a large number of descendant species that are adapted to a wide variety of habitats. So why were angiosperms so successful at this, at producing so many species from a single lineage? This diversification of angiosperms is associated with three key adaptations. The first is having water-conducting vessels. That is, the vascular tissues. Now, we see this in gymnosperms as well, but having it in angiosperms also helped in their evolution. And as we've been talking about today, flowers are very important in the rapid evolution of angiosperms, mainly linked to pollinators. Having a wide variety of pollinators associated with specific flowers allowed for the transfer of genes from one plant to another plant of the same species. And then fruits. And this is important because of how they help in the dispersal of seeds. So these three adaptations aided in the efficiency of the transportation of water, pollen, and seeds. These three adaptations allowed for this rapid evolution of many different descendant species from a common lineage. All right, let's move on to our last objective for today's video podcast, and that is the different groups of angiosperms. Now remember, the number of species of angiosperms is around 300,000. Over 250,000 of those exist in these four different groups. The first two groups comprise the most species of angiosperms, and the first group are the monocots. These include the grasses, palms, the orchids, corn, wheat, and rice. These last three I point out because they represent major world crops. Though I won't ask on an exam, just so you can keep a tally of the number of species, Monocots represent about 60,000 different species. Next, let's talk about the dicots, or sometimes we call these the eudicots. Within the dicots are the roses, daisies, oaks, beans, and peas. Many of the species in the dicots are used as medicines, perfumes, and timber to build homes and furniture and other things. This group here represents the largest number of angiosperms. There are about 200,000 species of dicots. Okay, let's talk about two other groups that have fewer species. The basal angiosperms. These are the oldest living lineages of angiosperms. They include water lilies and amborella. There are only about 200 species. There are only about 200 species of the basal angiosperms. And the last group I want to talk about are the magnolids. These include, not surprisingly, the magnolias, black pepper trees, and the tulip trees. This group of angiosperms is important because they are used extensively in medicine, food, and perfumes. There are about 9,000 species of magnolias. All right, there are just a couple more things that I want to talk about in this video podcast. And the first one is comparing monocots with dicots. They represent most of the angiosperms, so let's think about what makes them different. Well, one of the major differences is related to how they got their names. Monocots contain one cotyledon, and dicots contain two cotyledons. The cotyledons will represent the first leaves of the plant. They are also important in providing the nutrition that the plant embryo needs for germination and helps them to be established as a photosynthetic organism. Monocots usually have parallel veins in their leaves. The veins in a dicot are usually branched. Monocots have a random distribution of vascular tissues. Dicots have an orderly distribution of vascular tissues. The fourth difference between monocots and dicots is that in monocots, leaves usually come in threes. In dicots, the leaves usually occur in fours or fives. Monocots usually have a fibrous root. Dicots usually have a taproot. The difference between these two types of roots is that the fibrous roots usually grow horizontally, and so they move in many more directions, but they don't get as deep into the soil. Taproots grow downward, so they are able to get deep into the soil. The taproot, because it moves downward and reaches the depths of the soil, this anchors the plant more securely in the soil. The last thing I want to talk about in today's video podcast are plant defenses. Remember, plants have to do some pretty amazing things, all while not being able to move. So their defense mechanisms also have to center around them being unable to move. So I want to talk about three different mechanisms that plants will use for defenses. The first fall into the category of anatomical structures. So these might include spines, like you'd find on a cactus, thorns you might find on a rose. It could be thick layers of bark. The second defense mechanism fall into the category of sticky traps. A good example of this would be in the conifer trees. They secrete a sticky substance that traps attacking insects. The third and last defense mechanism I want to talk about are chemical compounds. many plants produce compounds that have a toxic effect on various herbivores that try to attack them. These chemicals can cause a physiological effect or a behavioral one. Over the years, we have found some of these compounds, in fact, many of these compounds, to be useful as medicines to either treat certain diseases like cancer, leukemia, malaria, heart disease, and some of these act as muscle relaxants or pain relievers. So what helps a plant stay alive, we've been able to take and use as chemicals to help us stay alive. Okay, that's all I have on this video podcast for today. It's the last of the series on plants. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you come see me. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.